keynote speaker, Professor Francesca Orsini, has now joined us online. Professor Orsini, please allow me to extend a very warm welcome to you on behalf of the Early Career Researchers Conclave and Colloquium 2025. I'm Kainat Kazal. I'm a junior research fellow here at ILSR and one of the conveners of this conclave. It is an honor to have you with us as one of our keynote speakers. Professor Orsini is interested in bringing a located and multilingual perspective to Indian literary history and world literature. Her most recent book is East of Delhi, Multilingual Literary Culture and World Culture, published by the Oxford University Press in 2023. She co-edits with Devjani Ganguly the series Cambridge Studies in World Literatures and Cultures, and with Whitney Cox, the forthcoming Cambridge History of Indian Literature. She is Professor Emerita of Hindi and South Asian Literature at SOAS, University of London, and a Fellow of the British Academy. Her keynote today is titled Looking Sideways, New Pathways and Significant Geographies for South Asian Research. The lecture will be followed by a Q&A. Professor Orsini, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kainat. I hope you can all hear me. I'm in a small village in Italy, so my connection is not always great. But I'm very pleased to be here, and since I don't have much time, let me open my PowerPoint and share what I want to say today. I hope you can see me, and I hope you can hear me properly. And I hope you had enough time for lunch. It seemed like a very short break. But anyway, so, and I hope that what I'm going to say resonates with your work and with the concern and the context of your meeting. So let me start. Okay. So my starting point is really sort of the 1990s, and when there was, as you all know, a lot of talk about globalization as a kind of a project and a process that had, reached its conclusion and sort of the new reality to which we all had to get used. And where a lot of the relationships between, the global was basically kind of seen as centered, or really the West, and then the local was really the other places that were not in the West. And the relationship between places was often mapped on this kind of global-local, where the local was the non-West and the global was the West. And in the sense of center-periphery relations. And so Wallerstein's world system theory became mapped onto all kinds of other, all other disciplines apart from economic history. So I'm a literary historian, so I really speak from the perspective of literary studies. But I think what also was interesting, so the global and globalization of literary culture was best exemplified by Pascal Casanova's World Republic of Letters, written in French. She's a student of Pierre Bourdieu. So you have the literary field being mapped now onto the global literary field. Sort of world system theory was kind of adapted to literature by the Warwick Research Collective, the REC, in that book, Combined and Uneven Development. And generally, so you had globalization, the global local, but you also had pretty much immediately critiques. For example, Sanjay Krishnan's very interesting book, Reading the Global, where he argues that the global is not a sort of reality, but a kind of instituted category. Or Lewis and Wigan's Myth of Continents, which is a really useful book on, warning, cautioning social scientists particularly, but also people working in the humanities, from applying geographical categories, unproblematically, like continents, like oceans, particularly the macro ones, onto their own work. Or an article by two feminist geographers whom I particularly like, called by Gibson Graham, called Beyond the Global and the Local, which you can find, Global versus Local, which you can find online, and it's a really interesting article. So, as I said, in literary studies, globalization took the form of the, you could say, the emergence of the idea of world literature, which had been, a kind of 19th century, early 20th century humanist ideal, and then had really taken just the form of certain anthologies of world literature or book series of world classics, and then courses in American literature or world literature in American universities on world literature. But in the 1990s, thanks particularly to David Damrosch at the University of Harvard, world literature re-emerged as comparative literature in the age of globalization. So you can do comparative literature now only with European languages or languages in literatures in European languages, or perhaps Latin American and American. In order to be really world, you need to engage with literature in from other parts of the world. But as Franco Moretti quickly put it, world literature can be the literature of the whole world, and so it's more like a problem. How do you manage it? And so these models that, in a way, explain the way parts of the non-West, the non-Europe, in ways that were manageable, as I said. And also, again, in literary studies, also really interesting, reflections on how the global economy was different from imaginings of the world. And here the work of Peinchea and Eric Hayot is particularly relevant. But at the same time also, and I think that's got a lot of traction in university departments, and particularly in the UK where I was working, the world literature really has taken place in departments of English literature. So the global Anglophone, which, as you can imagine, if you work on literatures not in English, or Indian literatures not in English, becomes a major category, but also a problematic one. And just how problematic world literature would be for people like us is the idea of Pascal Casanova of the Greenwich Meridian of literature, which is a geographical category. So US vegan again. Be careful. A meridian, a line which is not just a spatial line, but also a historical and a line of time. So the further you're away from this positive Greenwich Meridian of literature, the more more catching up you have to do. And basically, there's one meridian, there's one now, and one center. Yeah. Now, I think if we are speaking, and I speak as a kind of honorary Indian literary scholar, because I've been coming and working on India for the last, more than half my life, for the last 40 years, I've been struck by, in a way, a suspicion about globalization, which I certainly share, but also about world literature as this kind of Anglophone project, and this project that is linked to globalization. So it's interesting, for example, that, and I've been discussing it with colleagues, why there isn't really, I think there's a center in Bhubaneswar, but basically there's not really been an interest in world literature from, in scholars based in India. And at the same time, I'm struck at projects that I see done by PhD students, scholars, and young researchers, junior researchers like you, that comparison often tends to be made within an imperial framework. Sometimes about co-constitution, but so often is India and England, rather than India and somewhere else. So my call today, through some examples, is really an urge for you to look sideways and not think in this global center, periphery, global, local perspective, but look sideways. This comes out of a project that I was leading at SOAS for 5 years called Multilingual Local and Significant Geographies, which was an attempt at doing comparison between three South, you could say South-South comparison, North India, the Maghreb, so North Africa and the Horn of Africa, three different experiences of colonialism under Britain, France, and Italy, different lengths, but similarly all long-standing multilingual literary cultures, and with really some interesting also comparative problems, like problems with multilingualism, feeling that multilingualism is a problem that should be solved. But this was also for us an attempt to speak back to this sort of global center, periphery, Anglophone war literature, and say that war literature, this bird's eye view, but say that war literature is always located. Right? It's always a view from the ground, from somewhere located either geographically or intellectually, ideologically. It's always located and partial. And we try to put forward this idea not of one world, of which then the parts become part. The locals become part of this one world that is already there, but rather intersecting significant geographies. And significant geographies has now been used a bit, but often not in the sense that I had it in originally, which is really the idea of, as you say, significant others, the others that are significant for you. So what are the places, what are the conceptual, imaginative, and real geographies that matter for, so that recur, so not just once, but, that are recurring and matter for an individual, a group, or a, literary culture. And then the world is made up of these intersecting significant geographies. And here are some of the articles that are, again, freely available, or I can send them to you if you want, and you can look at our project website to get a sense of what we produced and what we went for. And very much our sense of space, this sense of plural, made up of interrelationship, came from feminist geographer Doreen Massey's conceptualization of space as always the product of interrelations and always contemporaneous plurality, but where distinct trajectories exist. So space, whether it's the world, whether it's Bengal, whether it's India, whether it's Calcutta, whether it's Milan or London, is never one thing, one story, one trajectory. It will always be constituted by multiplicity. Without multiplicity and no space. And also this idea of a vantage point, that there is no neutral, overall, overarching narrative. Every narrative has a vantage point. So from this perspective, let me offer to you three new works that I think are doing, in fact, this work of looking sideways in ways that might be interesting and useful for you. So one is the idea of, okay, let's look then for other significant geographies. So not just London, not just Calcutta and London, but what other geographies are significant, for example, from the perspective of Bengal. Then this idea that South-South relation, and again, I'm speaking as a literary scholar and historian, and this is a statement from another young literary scholar, comparatist, who works on Arabic and Urdu. He's done a lot of translations as well. And I think he makes this interesting point that South-South investigations, researches, will be optimally investigation plus theorization. And often people say, well, what's the theory? Where's the theory there? Well, the theory is, you create a space for theory. And you create a space for comparison by actually doing it. And I'll show you what I mean to my second example. And the third example is, because so much work is still being done on the colonial period or on the period of decolonization, to think through the very useful category that Stephanie Newell, an Africanist, African post-colonial literary scholar, has called the paracolonial, that which is enabled by colonialism, but exists alongside and beyond, so cannot be just explained through a colonial or imperial framework. So my first example is one by a young scholar from Bangladesh called Maharuba Mautushi, who did a really, really interesting original dissertation, thesis, and then book on Africa in the Bengali imagination. And I was, lucky to be one of the examiners. And you may have, yes, of course, Africa, but I hadn't really, heard and thought about this possible significant geography. And what I think is really interesting in the book is the fact that, again, it's plurality of perspectives. And not necessarily also a linear trajectory, but really they're kind of layered or multiple trajectories, multiple perspectives as well. Perspective from Kolkata, perspective from Uganda, perspective from Mombasa, and so on. And just to give you a little sense of this book, so she starts with two chapters on what we may call sub-imperial adventure. So the Bengali graduate, in fact, who goes to Africa to work on the railway in Vibhuti Bhushan's Chandar Pahar, but then quickly becomes a kind of an adventurer looking for, the mountain of the moon and the, diamonds and it's a thrilling story, and I think you can really see the really interesting way in which the hero is is very much a colonial subject, but he gets out of his position within the kind of imperial economy and follows his own trajectory of being an adventurer. And yes, he says that he'll use all the diamonds that he has extracted from the African mine to pay for the dowry of Bengali girls. So he's got this interesting kind of perspective and position as both himself imperial extractor, but also sort of using it to change his position within and change the position of the community. Then the kind of the flipping over of this perspective in Tagore's poems of solidarity against the Italian invasion of Abyssinia, where instead Asia and India are, this is very much an imagined geography. So imagine as sisters, as coming up of their, it imagines Africa as being somehow isolated and, one thing, but it imagines it as a good thing, as an aesthetic kind of, now it can sort of fulfill its role in the world. And then the two very interesting chapters on Bengalis who actually went to work in East Africa. And one of them, Rajat Nyogi, became an important cultural figure as the editor of the magazine Transition, which is one of the most important African, but also kind of literary magazines, which was discovered at one point to have been funded through the Congress for Cultural Freedom, so kind of part also of the Cold War, but certainly not pursuing a pro-American stance. So this is really a way in which Africa becomes, you can see that it becomes an object, and it becomes actually quite a complex object of relations and imaginations for Bengalis. And my sense that, and I remember, I think there's a line in one of the books on the Bay of Bengal and the Indian Ocean, that much more work needs to be done, for example, and I can imagine work on the imagination of Myanmar or Burma, the Bengali imagination, or Japan or other locations, or China, other locations, and what do they sparkle and what shape do they take in the Bengali imagination. My second point is this about, and the second example is about South-South investigation and theorization. And this is a book by Adhira Mangalagiri, which takes, in a way, a more established locus of comparison between China and India. But very interestingly, doesn't go for the Hindi Chini Pai Pai sort of decades of intense friendship and cooperation, but looks at the troughs of the relationship. So not at moments of antagonism or relationships of antagonism and moments of crisis. And this helps her to theorize more broadly. Compare, if comparatists often look at moments of joining, of friendship, a kind of restorative mood. She argues that actually we also need to attend to instead comparison instead as a function of antagonism or crisis. Through these notions, through these concepts that she elaborates of friction, so friction which is antagonism but is still a relationship, it's still a joint, yes, it is still, you have a relationship with somebody is significant for you. Ellipsis, which you could almost say like erasure, but there is something underneath, and contingency, so moments that don't have a follow-up, but something gets produced in that moment. And so she looks at those Chinese and Hindi literary texts. She looks at Chinese stories and novels about particularly the Punjabi, but the Indian policeman in Shanghai as a figure of hatred, as a kind of servant of the imperial kind of oppressor. Then a bunch of stories by the important Hindi poet and writer Ecrc, which he wrote in a very short period of time in the early 40s, which serve him to imagine the revolution. So he writes, he was a revolutionary. He's actually at that time working in the Indian army, and he's sort of thinking through revolution through these Chinese stories. So this kind of contingency. And then a very interesting chapter on, among other chapters, on the 1962 war, the great unleashing of propaganda, of course, against and shock against the Chinese aggression, and Hindi poets, but Hindi poets who write, propaganda against, write poems attacking the Chinese, but also poets like Shamsher Bahadur Singh, like whose poem is on the cover, who had written, who had read translations of Chinese poetry, of which, of course, there were several in the 1940s and 50s, and writes a much more reflexive, much more kind of, you could say, ambivalent and ambiguous poem. So this is this ellipsis, or this friction that shows that the relationship was still there. And I think this is a brilliant example of, again, a South-South relationship which becomes a way of theorizing, actually for comparative literature as a whole. So she has her final chapter is on a comparatist guide to disconnect, which I think will be read by comparatists working, on very different literatures. My third example is from another research project that was conducted by my colleague and friend Catherine Schofield at King's College London, which really was, became a study of paracolonial relations and paracolonial sort of processes, you could say, and formations. So it thinks through music, the transition to colonialism, which has been, as some of you will know, very much sort of written in terms of a kind of break, an epistemic rupture, break with the Hindustani past, or the past in South India, and rewritten by sort of Indian elite male musicologists who sideline whether Devadasis and sort of female performers or the Muslim ustads as ignorant and kind of ignorant of their own knowledge, whereas Indian music is found, origins in the Natya Shastra, and in Sanskrit treatises are found. Now, what instead, by again taking two geographies and showing that they were significant to each other, so Malay and North India, and showing how much traffic there was of music and musicians across the Bay of Bengal, whether it's Muharram, whether it's music bands, whether it's elite musicians, whether it's instruments, and so on. And so, actually making a lot of more things visible. So histories of sound, of instruments, of songs, of emotions. But it also argues, and I highlighted there in the slide, that system of musical knowledge operated alongside and beyond the colonial state throughout this period. So if colonial infrastructures like technologies like railways, print, steam boats, gramophone, facilitated these systems, but they were not necessarily, and the system were not necessarily, and often they not even depended on colonial epistemologies. Rather, they coexisted in different relations and tensions. And so, for example, they show that the ustads were by no means illiterate, that some of them in fact participated, and definitely you could say they rode the colonial the transition to colonialism and managed to reinvent themselves, to remain very strong holders of musical knowledge and be part of the the new festival circuit, the new concert circuit, and so on. And so I think again this is a really useful example, not to even when you're working on a colonial period, object or phenomenon or text and so on, not to immediately slide just in the colonial, but think of whether it exists or coexists or works, at a tangent with colonialism. And certainly that's what I found. That's been my argument for also literary transition to colonialism, that one has tended to emphasize, then perhaps overemphasize, for example, the novel or print as a function of, the new, whether it's magazines or, education and so on. But actually, as my, book Print and Pleasure, my second book showed, if one looks at commercial publishing, then a whole host of other older genres and new genres become visible and were certainly much more popular. Or if we can look at theater, music, and so on. So I'm coming to my conclusions, and so my urge would be to really think beyond this sort of simple binary of global versus local, to try and look sideways and think of more significant geographies, which you can start from one text or one author or one travel, and then actually we should see that these often are not lone examples, but a whole kind of little ecology grows around them. And also I think we need, South-South investigations and theorizations, and I think the burgeoning, work in South concepts from the Global South, like this in this volume edited by Dilip Menon and others. I think we need those, not just to get trapped in categorical frameworks that already exist. And these are just some of the kind of some of the you could say theorizations or concepts or keywords that we tried to throw in the mix of world literature, and also to say that this may look like a very non-political kind of scholarship, but I think it is. It's actually a scholarship that tries to valorize, so not give all the power to the global, and valorize, as Gibson and Graham and others do, the diversity as actually existing diversity and diversity that matters. Thank you. I think I'll stop here.
Walking in the field of world literary studies, or what you call looking sideways. Now, I completely agree with your proposition of going beyond this normative frame of the north versus south and the west versus the east, and looking sideways, the south-south investigation. These are very important parameters to move ahead. But my only question is that when we proceed in that direction, the reference points in terms of the publication words remain within the West. For example, all the references are coming within Western publication references, and also scholarly works being published from very high profile and so-called quote-unquote flagship journals and publishing houses. So when we talk about looking sideways, do you think that this is also important, that we listen to people speaking in their own voice in terms of vernacular local publications? Because when we talk about global versus the local, what about the vast amount of local small press publication houses which are actually being used by the local people? They're not named at all in the global parlance of scholarship. I mean, almost all the references in the contemporary work on world literature is mostly either published by Routledge or Oxford or Cambridge University presses, or even the American University presses. So while I completely welcome and agree with your very important proposition for looking sideways, is it also to be combined with this equal amount of looking sideways in terms of the publications and the writings being published locally and written locally? Your view on that?
Um, I have.
Yes, actually, I think. Should I answer or should I?
Can I add to Professor Purokash's question, because I have similar kind of question. Can I add to that?
Sorry, I didn't get the last.
Can I add to the question, Professor Oksini?
Sure.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
sure, of course.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. So I like the idea of South dialogue, but the point I want to raise is that there are many centers within South. For example, when I am sitting in Bengal, in Calcutta, there is obviously a Calcutta centricity in terms of knowledge production, writing, and everything. And there is complete absence of writings from the districts or the so-called peripheries and margins. So when we talk about South-South dialogue, then the dialogue happens between Kolkata and maybe Shanghai, or so. I mean, how to overcome that gap? Thank you.
Should I answer?
Yes, please.
Okay. If I can take the second, actually, my latest book, East of Delhi, is very much all about the province, and actually not about, this is more about early modern, you could say Sultanate literary history in North India. And I've been very, it seems to me that often one talks about, Mughal literature, Mughal culture, Mughal art, as if only the court exists, imperial court. And so, as if, we don't, and so my whole book is about, Qasbas, small towns in Pura, in the area of Awadh, eastern UP, you could say now, and taking them and very much writing or even non-writing, oral literature in, both local languages, but also in, the cosmopolitan language of Persian, but written from a provincial side. So I think it's absolutely true. I think, as I said, for me, located is really an important point. The idea that, you're reading certain accounts of world literature, it seems like, getting recognized by Paris or by London or by New York is like the final aim and goal of all writers in the world. And while, of course, I understand, then usually what I told is, oh, well, you're very naive, you're not thinking about power relations. Of course I'm thinking about power relations, but I think that those power relations do not exhaust the existence and the meaning and importance of other relationships and other audiences and other literary production that will never get viewed by Paris or London or New York because they're just, uninterested or ignorant. So I often also talk about the ignorance of the center, the centers who don't know what they don't know. So, and therefore, are uninterested. In the West, I think it's true. It would be true that a lot of literary and other, scholars from, not just India, but of course also Africa, Middle East, and so on, now are working in universities often in the US, the UK, but there aren't many jobs anymore. But I hope, and certainly that's been my experience, that they don't, just because this is published by New York, it doesn't mean that it's, it expresses a location that is from there. Huh? But in fact, apart from the fact that, all my books were published from India before this last one, I think that there is a more of a, conversation and a give and take and so on. And in fact, two more points I want to make. One is, in fact, I've been, very, very impressed by the work that, for example, Siegel has been doing from Kolkata. I think Siegel has become a major, or possibly the major world theatre publishing house from Kolkata. There's nothing that stops this sort of sideway and out-facing gazes. However, it seems to me, and in fact, I put this question to one of your colleagues, Sucheta Bhattacharya from Jadavpur, how much is world literature something that, in the oldest and most distinguished comparative department in India, how much is that, a question? And she said that, interestingly, she had posed this question to her colleagues and students, and said that, actually there's a kind of more interest in the world as in the worlds within India, maybe in local languages, Adivasi literature, certainly in Hindi there's more a sense of that what matters is political literature than, literature outside. It's like literature outside is like this global that we're not really very interested in. So my plea is actually to say, no, one can do really interesting work like Maruba Motushi, yes, a book. And to be honest, again, Routledge, we know there's a Routledge India. I think that might be Routledge India. We know that because of their own quantity, some of these academic publishers are, have a branch or have operations in more than one country. So just to brand them as Western, I think is kind of a bit, not quite correct.
Thank you so much, Professor Orsini. I think we'll have to move on to the next session now. So unfortunately, we will not be able to take any more questions. However, if you allow, we can ask the researchers here to post their questions through email to us, and then maybe